Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 3rd of April of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates and details, lots of political events, lots of changes on the ground and clashes and very interesting results of battles on the ground. During the previous video we have already discussed some kind of redeployment of forces in Romania towards the border with Moldova and Ukraine, so we see another step of escalation. We haven't discussed, let's say, another topic from Finland that today already the 7th guarantee Ukraine and Finland have signed a security agreement, and this is of course not very good piece of news for the Russians. More and more countries are openly support Ukraine, and obviously there are, let's say, open part of agreements, and obviously there are, let's say, closed part of agreements, and Zelensky probably promised something to the Western countries. Currently we don't know for sure what exactly, but obviously soon we're gonna find this out. And of course lots of updates on the ground. And today I would like to start with you with Belogorovka direction, because as I understand, to my opinion, probably this is one of the most important, let's say, directions currently, not Avdiivka area, not Mykhailivka, but Belogorovka itself. And today we got additional reports from the territory. First, let's discuss the icons we have, and as you can see we don't have lots of icons, some icons in the vicinity of Sporne. The Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions with artillery, for forces systems with anti-tank missiles, so just a regular activity with the purpose to for the Russians to finally to break through defense in this area and to capture this small village or the ruins that left from the village. We have few FPV drone strikes around Belogorovka that we have already discussed. Some of them were published in the vicinity of the landfill, let's say right in front of the landfill. Few more FPV drone strikes along the Siversk river. And the question is, what is so important about the battle? And also we have the flag confirming the Russian progress towards the forest that we discussed yesterday. I'll remind you just before we start with the main part that a few days ago, or during the previous days, during the previous 2 days, the Russians conducted a very powerful offensive operation towards the forest that located to the southwest of the landfill and to the south of Belogorovka. And according to geolocations we have, the Russians managed to reach the line, and very likely the Russians managed to enter the forest that located also on the south of Belogorovka and on the southwest of the landfill. So very likely the Russians currently are here. So, but we don't have any geolocations, any video confirming this. But today we got another very important report. We got the report of the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation. Let's take a look at this report, because the report gives us a lot of very interesting details about the situation in the area. And the most important part is starting somewhere here. According to information we have, according to the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation, 10 counterattacks launched by the Armed Forces of Ukraine 81st Air Mobile Brigade, 10 Mountain Assault Brigades, 76 72nd Mechanized Brigades and 4th National Guard Brigade of Ukraine were repelled close to Belogorovka, Lugansk People Republic, Berestova, Krasnaya, Bogdanovka and Konstantinovka, Donetsk People's Republic. According to the Ministry of Defense, the previous 24 hours were one of the difficult days since the beginning of the special military operation on the direction. The Russians repelled 10 counterattacks. Usually the Ukrainians, let's say, counterattack the Russian positions maybe 3, 4, 5 times in a row in a day, but not 10 times. So, as a result of those counterattacks, those attacks from the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians lost 390 soldiers, troopers, 2 armored fighting vehicles, and as well as 19 motor vehicles. So let's return back to map, trying to understand what did happen. First of all, this is 81st Air Mobile Brigade, and according to the Minister of Defense, they were counterattacking the Russians. And there is just one reason why the Ukrainians can counterattack the Russians, and is we are talking about improving of Russian positions. So very likely, once again, we don't have any geolocated videos confirming this, but very likely the Russians, as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, managed to establish control over the forest or to enter the forest, and that's why the Ukrainians were counterattacking this area with everything they had, with the forces, of course, of 81st Air Mobile Brigade. Currently, we can't tell for sure whether the Russians managed to repel the attack, not, let's say, officially, because according to the Ministry of Defense, they managed to repel all of them and to dig in deeper on the direction. very likely the Ukrainians would continue their counterattacks, because the Ukrainians understand if the Russians are able to dig in deeper in the forest, and furthermore, and not even worse, if the Russians, according to for Ukrainians, if the Russians are able to establish complete control over this forest, then we can start counting days before Bilogorovka will be encircled and will fall. So now this is the current situation, and currently this is the most important battle of, let's say, the beginning of April, that currently take place to the south of Bilogorovka and to the southwest of the landfill. Once again, if the Russians are able to establish control, then the entire Bilogorovka will fall probably within the next few weeks or something like this. And this will open the Russians the gates and window of opportunity to continue further offensive operations towards Siversk, to encircle the Ukrainian forces in the Kremenaya forest, and many other things and benefits that the Russians would obtain as a result of the battle for the area. Furthermore, according to the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade, this brigade was counterattacking the Russian forces in direction of Berestova. If you remember, a few days ago, we discussed that there were very heavy clashes and that the Russians launched their offensive operation, and the Russians were trying to capture along the railways or to improve their positions towards the railway station Velyka. We discussed that we also haven't received any geolocations or any updates confirming whether the Russians managed to establish control over the territory or not, but the only thing we got today is that Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours conducted significant number of counterattacks, trying to force the Russians to fall back somewhere between Velyka and Berestova. And as I understand, the Russians and the Ukrainians were talking about this part. So as you can see, currently Siversk direction is the most active with significant number of forces, and the Russians are pushing with the purpose to finish the battle for Siversk and to start the final battle for the final agglomeration of Donetsk People Republic, and we're talking about Slaviansk and Kramatorsk. Now let's move a little bit to the north in direction of Terny. Another day, another nightmare for the Russian forces on the direction. As we discussed during the previous months, the Russians, to finish the battle in Avdiivka and on other directions, since the beginning of the year, there was some refactoring, let's say reconfiguration of the line of the front lines of the group of armies who's responsible for what, and lots of forces from this direction were redeployed to other directions. And after that, we start seeing this picture. We see significant number of FPV drone strikes and artillery strikes of the armed forces of Ukraine on the Russian positions, and we can see complete absence of Russian resistance and Russian counter activity against the Ukrainian positions. And this is very important, because today the Russians conducted another offensive operation against the Ukrainian forces. That was another very powerful attack with the use of significant number of armored vehicles and tanks. The Russians were moving in convoy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 armored vehicles just on this video. There were a few more armored vehicles already on the line of combat contact, and just pay attention to the number of artillery strikes and the focus of Ukraine armored forces. So the situation was very difficult, and another Russian attack probably was repelled somewhere in this area by Ukraine, mainly artillery forces and Ukraine FPV drones. So the Russians couldn't even get the first line of contact, and they were repelled just during their way to Terny. So this is the situation in the area, and we see that the situation is getting more and more complicated. The Russians need to find a solution how to counter the Ukraine FPV drone strikes and the Ukraine artillery. Furthermore, we got few more artillery strikes from the armed forces of Ukraine between Terny and Zhitlovka and Kremenaya itself. Now let's move to the north in direction of north in Kupiansk direction. There were no updates. There have been no updates from the direction for probably the previous maybe even 2 months or something like this. And starting on the 3rd of April, we start receiving lots of updates from the territory. First, and the most important, the Russians destroyed with the FAB 500 another temporary deployment point of armed forces of Ukraine in the vicinity of Borova. And later, to be more precisely this morning, we got report that combat operation intensified in Kupiansk direction west of Svatova. The Ukraine armed forces lost several strongholds. That was the first update that was published somewhere at AM times of the local area. And later, right before I start making the video, we got another report that the Russians launched an offensive operation in direction of Mykhailivka, and as a result of offensive operation, the Ukrainians lost few more strongholds on this direction as well. So the attack took place between Kalemychiha and Mykhailivka. Currently, we can't tell for sure which strongholds the Russians and which 3 lines the Russians captured, but we see some activity and complete absence of any movements from the area of Sinkovka and Kupiansk direction, so Kupiansk area. So something interesting is started here. So obviously all these things are tightly connected all together, starting from Razdolovka, Berestovaya, Vyemka, Belogorovka, Terny, and still Mykhailivka. This is one common big front line. Now we are moving further to Bakhmut Artyomov's direction, where we also got additional reports and additional updates. According to information we have, the Russians managed to break through the Ukraine defense belt and to reach the sign of Chasiv Yar. According to information we have, Chasiv Yar sign is 100 meters from Russian control zone. So less than 500 meters to forward observers of the Russian armed forces. So the Russians are getting very close to Chasiv Yar, yet there were no clashes inside of the town itself, but the Russians are getting ready. So very soon, maybe so slowly, step by step, at one day, maybe even on Sunday, we're gonna start talking that the Russians have already entered and the clashes start for the first building. Anyway, this is going to be probably a primary target for the Russians during the next few weeks as well. When talking about Ivanovska, today we got the final confirmation, video confirmation of Russian full control over the Ivanovska town. If you remember, during the previous days, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the entire Ivanovska was captured by the Russians without providing us any geolocated videos confirming that. But today we got the geolocation from the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians published the video of how they were repelling another wave of Russian attack towards the western part of the village, and as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to establish complete control. So we have the, let's say, the video confirming the Russian progress in the western outskirts and the southwestern outskirts of the city. Furthermore, some mappers reported that the Russians didn't stop and they moved further. Let's say, gaining momentum, the Russians moved further and the Russians entered the forest to the west of Ivanovska village. So according to some mappers, this is approximately the current control over the territory. So the situation, as you can see, is very difficult for the Ukrainians. If the Russians are able to reach the canal, let's say this, if the Russians are able to establish control over this part, then let's say one Ukrainian defense belt from Kalinovka to Klishevka will be split in 2 parts, and then the Russians will handle with the southern one and the northern one separately. Probably this is exactly what the Russians are trying to do right now. Now we are moving to Avdiivka direction. We have a few more updates from the territory. Still, we haven't received any geolocations and any video confirming Russian control in the western part of Berdichi. If you remember, yesterday we discussed the video of multiple launch rocket system that, according to some Ukrainian sources, were made by the Ukrainians on the Russian forces, but lots of mappers, a lot of asynchronous sources have already, let's say, pointed that that post probably was mistaken. Maybe that was strikes of armed forces of Russian Federation against the Ukraine positions. For now, we can't make any decision to change color or not, so that's why we'll keep the area as is. But we got another video from the same territory, a little bit to the northwest from a regional position. This is, if you take a look at the bottom left corner, this one, you're gonna see the Berdichi part that, according to yesterday's video, was captured by the Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group. And today we got the video from the north, a little bit to the northwest of the previous area of Berdichi, of how the Russians were bombing the area with multiple launch rocket systems. So as you can see, yesterday there was a multiple launch rocket system a little bit to the southeast from these positions, and today we have probably the strike of the same weapon in this area. So we see that more and more sources confirming that very likely that the yesterday video was the attack of armed forces of Russian Federation on Ukrainian positions. Anyway, despite the fact that whether there were Russians or the Ukrainians, we see that there is a very heavy clashes. The Russians continue pushing, but yet we haven't received any details or any updates whether the Russians managed to capture Berdichi. From the other side, we continue receiving updates from the Umanska area. According to information we have, as we discussed in the previous update, the Russians have already established complete control over the area between Orlovka and Toninka and the fields and positions in front of Umanska. This is the approximately the Russian control. and the Russians are pushing further. So let's wait more. We don't have, let's say, new updates in comparison with the previous. So something is happening here, but without any changes on the ground. Now we're moving to Pervomayska area. A few more artillery systems of armed forces of Ukraine were destroyed as a result of counter-artillery duels. Another artillery system was destroyed with Krasnopol hit. I mentioned that I would like to point your attention that recently the Russians started using this type of weapon massively. Almost every single day we got another video of Krasnopol hit and another destroyed Ukraine artillery position. So very accurate and very powerful weapon. Few more Krasnopol strikes took place on the southwest of Marinka. On this video, for example, we can see destroyed D-20 howitzer of armed forces of Ukraine, and a little bit to the south in the area of Ilinka, another artillery system, probably it was also another D-20 howitzer, was also destroyed here. So counter-artillery duels are very successfully conducted by the Russians. Interesting details I would like to discuss with you about Krasnogorovka. If you remember, during the march in February, the Russians made a lot of attempts to attack the southern part of the village, and there were very heavy clashes in the area. The Ukrainians were forced to redeploy their 3rd Azov brigade to stabilize the situation, and after that the clashes stopped. But today we got the video, this one. On this video, that the event took place on the 1st of April of 2024. The Russians discovered the Ukraine FPV drone operator base, control center, and they destroyed this, let's say, building with Russian FPV or Russian artillery, or something with Russian FPV. And this situation took place here. So that's why I believe that it's very unsafe to keep FPV drone base very close to the Russian positions. So very likely, currently there are no more Russian positions inside of Krasnogorovka. Very likely the southern part, this residential area, either in the gray zone or under complete Ukraine control. As I understand, the closest and the nearest Russian positions are located along the road, this one, along the coal mine or something like this. So this is the current situation in Krasnogorovka direction. Now we are moving to Novomykhailivka. We have additional updates, additional interesting information. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the western part, and currently we now understand and know where exactly the Russians, how and where exactly the Russians are planning to attack to finish the battle for the village. By my timings, according to my estimations, on the Wednesday the Russians should have already established control over Novomykhailivka, but as we can see, there are still clashes in the western part. The Ukrainians still redeploy reinforcements and reserves that are destroyed, let's say, by the Russians. And on this video, for example, we see how the Russians were bombing the southwestern part of Novomykhailivka with multiple launch rocket systems and with the TOS flamethrower systems. This area was under very heavy fire, and if we increase the numbers of days since the beginning of April, we can see that this is not the first strike on the direction. So the certain concentration of Russian artillery confirms that very likely the Russians are planning to attack something like this and to establish the final foothold exactly on this area. And then this is going to be the final hours of the battle for Novomykhailivka, and the Ukrainians will just start running away. Regarding and despite the situation of Novomykhailivka, the Russians decided not to stop, and they continue movement further to the west towards the main road between Konstantinovka, Vodyane, and Ugledar. Furthermore, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation today reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to improve their positions further in direction of Vodyane. So in South Donetsk direction, the Vostok group of forces units improved the tactical situation and inflicted the fire damage on the manpower and hardware of the armed forces of Ukraine of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade. So this video and the progress that we discussed in the previous video completely correspond to that Ministry of Defense report. The Russians are heading further to the west in direction of the 0524 road, and the Ukrainians were attacking the Russians. We have another video how the Russian soldiers were moving through the tree lines to the north, and they were under very heavy fire with the cluster rounds of armed forces of Ukraine. Ugledar, more and more updates are coming from the town. The Russians continue pummeling the city with FAPs and artillery, which confirms certain Russian focus, and probably this is 4th or 5th day in a row of the Russian very heavy activities on the direction, and we can make few conclusions. Currently, as you can see, the Russians are about to finish the battle for Novomykhailivka, are about to start clashes for Konstantinovka. Of course, the Russians want to complete the story of Ugledar and Vodyane, but the Ukrainians still have a lot of reserves on the direction. So that's why the Russians are attacking from every single direction with the purpose to stretch the Ukrainian forces and, let's say, to play this game better than them. So the Ukrainians at some point can concentrate forces on Ugledar, expecting the Russian attack. Meanwhile, the Russians will attack towards Vodyane. So now it's very difficult for the Ukrainians because the Ukrainians need to decide where to keep operational reserves. And when the Ukrainians made this decision, the Russians very likely will attack somewhere else, and this can lead to complete collapse of defense belt. Now we're moving to Avdiivka tactical bridgehead. We have few more videos on the southern part of Robotyne. If you remember, during the beginning of April, the Russians conducted offensive operation trying to enter the southern part of the village. That attack was repelled, but during that repelling, the Ukrainians revealed their own positions, and now the Russians, during the previous few days and today, were attacking and bombing the discovered Ukrainian positions, ammo depots, supply roads, fire positions, anti-tank positions. So very likely, after a few more days of the same process, the Russians will start offensive operation with the purpose to enter the southern part of Robotyne and to capture the farms to the south of the village. So, and this is going to be the beginning of the storming operation with the purpose to restore the foothold the Russians lost during the Ukrainian greatest counteroffensive. Robotyne, we haven't received anything new from this direction, just regular clashes, regular activities. We discussed in the morning the Russians managed to improve their positions towards the main supply road 0408 between Robotyne and Novosilka. There is already FPV drone fire control over the territory. The Ukrainians can't use this area without having losses or being damaged by the Russian FPV drones. So anyway, we see the Russians continue offensive Kupiansk, the road 0408, and we know that there are also always Russian attacks, Russian attempts to establish control over the fields between Verbova and Robotyne itself. So the clashes are very heavy, and very likely tomorrow we're going to receive more progress from the Russian side. Now let's move to political events. We have a lot of very interesting details, and they're coming from Russia, from Moscow. We have a report that, according to information we have, let's say Bloomberg is saying that Russia's summer offensive could break through Ukrainian defenses. The publication writes that Russia is ahead of Ukraine's allies in the ammunition race, and the flow of Western military aid to Ukrainian regime has sharply decreased. So in June, according to Bloomberg, the Russians are planning to collapse the Ukrainian defense belt. Currently, we can't tell for sure where exactly, but this is obviously going to take place. Furthermore, Russian oil export reached highest level this year, also was stated by Bloomberg. And this is also very important, because the Russians now has not just plans to start offensive to break the defense belt, but also the Russians have money. Also, we have report that, according to information we have, over the last 10 days, about 16,000 Russians have signed contracts to participate in the special military operation. According to the Ministry of Defense, as we discussed, every month the Russians sign the contracts with another 30,000 soldiers. When talking about Ukraine, today Zelensky stated that Russia is going to start mobilization on June 1st, and the Russians, according to him, is preparing to mobilize 300,000 troopers. It's very difficult to understand, and it's up to you to believe or not Zelensky. But if you ask my opinion, I believe him, because Zelensky is going to sign his own mobilization law. He has already reduced the level of mobilization age from 27 till 25. And very likely he's going to announce about, let's say, 500,000 mobilization, maybe less, maybe a little more. It doesn't matter. The thing is that now we see that there is a progress on the ground, but the progress is not so fast. It's progress step by step. The situation completely develops in the Russian favor. But the thing is that if Zelensky mobilizes another 500,000, and if he deploy 500,000 on the line of combat contact, obviously the Russian progress will be reduced. The speed of the Russian progress will be reduced, and so that's why the Russians are interested in saving of their speed, of their, let's say, the way they attack. So that's why, let's say, not to lose the speed, the Russians may launch mobilization, let's say, to get as fast as possible additional forces, and just not to lose the time, just not to lose the speed of offensive operation. Very likely something like this might happen. And we'll see, of course, we'll see what is going to be next. And of course, probably not the last, but at least a report that Finland also today, already, the 7th guarantee, Ukraine and Finland have signed a security agreement. In addition to military support, Finland will help rebuild the energy sector, protect the border, and treat Ukrainian military personnel. So now we know France is going to send forces, maybe Finland, lots of countries, lots of alliances have already been created by the Western countries. So we'll see on what the situation on the ground and whether they can change the situation on the ground in the current configuration. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye.